There's a story historians have been debunking for over a century, and it's still the first thing most people learn about the Balfour Declaration. It goes like this: a Jewish chemist invents a chemical Britain needs to win the war, and in gratitude, the British Empire hands him a country. It's a great story. It's also almost entirely false. In this video, you'll find out what actually happened. A financial empire on the brink of collapse. 3 secret and contradictory promises made to 3 different peoples, and a letter of exactly 67 words that is still shaping wars fought this year. This is the real story of the Balfour Declaration. Let's start with the story you probably already know. Chaim Weizmann, a biochemist working out of a lab in Manchester, discovers a way to mass-produce acetone through bacterial fermentation. Acetone is essential for making cordite, the propellant that fires naval shells. Britain is running out of it. Weizmann hands Britain the solution. Grateful, the government asks what he wants in return. He says, a homeland for the Jewish people. Balfour is moved. The declaration follows. It's a clean, satisfying story. George Bernard Shaw even wrote a play about it in 1936 called Arthur and the Acetone, dramatizing the moment Balfour supposedly asks Weizmann what he wants. And Weizmann answers, I want Jerusalem. Here's the problem. The man who became Britain's first High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, personally shot this story down while Weizmann was still alive. He called it dramatic but incorrect and unfortunate to treat the Balfour Declaration as if it were a payment, like a knighthood handed out for services rendered. And Samuel would know. He was in the room for the political maneuvering that actually produced the declaration. So if it wasn't a reward for a chemistry patent, what was it? The truth is both less romantic and far more consequential. Weizmann's science did matter, but not because it bought him a country. It mattered because it got him access. Before the acetone process, Weizmann was a lecturer with strong opinions and good connections in Manchester's liberal political circles. After it, he was a man the Ministry of Munitions owed favors to, a man who could get a cabinet minister on the phone. Access is not the same thing as leverage large enough to redirect imperial foreign policy. What actually redirected British foreign policy was something much bigger than one chemist's patent. Britain, in 1917, was running out of money, running out of allies with cash, and running out of time. To understand the Balfour Declaration, you have to stop looking at November 1917 as a moment of British generosity. You have to look at it as a moment of British desperation. In 1914, when Britain entered the First World War, its national debt stood at £650 million. That's a big number, but it represented a very manageable slice of the economy, around 30% of GDP, a figure Britain had spent the entire Victorian and Edwardian eras working to bring down. By the time the war ended in 1918, that number had exploded to somewhere between £7 and 10 pence and £7.7 billion, depending on which treasury ledger you check. Britain's debt-to-GDP ratio didn't creep upward. It went from roughly 25% to 125% in 4 years. To put that in perspective, Britain borrowed, in 4 years, the equivalent of an entire year of the nation's total economic output, a scale of peacetime equivalent borrowing that had never happened before and hasn't happened since. Where did all this money go? Defense spending, which had stood at £72.5 million a year before the war, ballooned to £1.4 billion a year by 1916-17, a jump from about 3% of GDP to over 40%. Britain wasn't just arming itself. As the wealthiest economy among the Allied powers, and the financial capital of the world, Britain took on the role of banker for the entire coalition, bankrolling France, Russia, Italy, and a dozen smaller allies simultaneously. London wasn't just fighting a war. London was underwriting one. Taxes rose sharply. Income tax went from just over a shilling in the pound to 6 shillings, a jump to roughly 30%. And excess profits duty on business climbed to 80%. And still, taxation covered only about a quarter of what the war actually cost. The rest had to be borrowed, and borrowed at a pace that terrified the people managing it. Here's a detail most people have never heard. Britain's very first war bond issue in November 1914 was a public failure. It raised less than a third of its £350 million target. Rather than let the world see Britain's credit falter in month 4 of the war, the Bank of England secretly covered the shortfall itself, funneling money through personal accounts registered to the chief, cashier and his deputy to hide where it had really come from. John Maynard Keynes, one of the few officials who knew the truth, called it a masterly manipulation, Britain's financial strength. Even this early in the war was partly an illusion held together by concealment. But the real crisis came in the spring of 1917, and it came from an unexpected direction: Washington. By late 1916, Britain and France were both leaning heavily on the New York banking house J.P. Morgan and Co. to keep the Allied war machine financed. Morgan proposed issuing short-term U.S. Treasury bills to raise fresh capital. President Woodrow Wilson personally blocked it. Wilson wasn't neutral about being neutral. He wanted the belligerents to come to the table, and he calculated that cutting off cheap American credit might force them to. It was, in effect, financial leverage used as a peace tactic. The gambit didn't end the war, but it exposed exactly how fragile the Allied financial position really was. By the spring of 1917, Britain's overdraft with J.P. Morgan alone had reached nearly $400 million, a staggering sum for the time, and money Britain did not have. France, meanwhile, had, in the words of historians studying the crisis, reached the end of its tether. Britain could probably have staggered, uncovering its own bills a while longer. Covering the entire Allied coalition's bills as well was a different question, and the honest answer inside the Treasury was, not for much longer. What actually rescued Britain wasn't a clever new bond scheme. It was the United States entering the war in April 1917. American belligerency reopened the credit taps and pulled Britain back from the edge. But it also raised a new, uncomfortable question that senior officials were already asking themselves. Was the United States, the rising financial superpower, about to eclipse the British Empire as the center of global finance? This is the atmosphere inside the British War Cabinet in mid to late 1917. An empire that had gone from confident creditor to desperate borrower in 3 years, propped up by American money it didn't fully control, watching its own global financial dominance start to slip. This is the room the Balfour Declaration was drafted in. Not a room of imperial swagger. A room of imperial anxiety. Financial desperation explains why Britain was looking for leverage everywhere it could find it. It doesn't by itself explain why the Middle East specifically became the place Britain went looking. For that, you need to understand the strategic asset Britain was actually trying to protect and the extraordinary game of promising the same territory to more than one party at once. The asset was the Suez Canal. By 1917, the canal was Britain's lifeline to India, to Australia, to the entire eastern half of its empire. Whoever controlled the land bridge around Suez, the Sinai, Palestine, the routes east, controlled Britain's ability to move troops, supplies, and trade between London and the empire's most valuable territories. With the Ottoman Empire, Germany's ally, sitting directly astride that route, securing the post-war Middle East wasn't a side project for British strategists. It was close to the top of the list. So Britain made a promise. In 1915 and 1916, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, exchanged a series of letters with Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the leader of the Hashemite family and a figure with genuine authority across much of the Arab world. The offer: if the Arabs rose up and fought the Ottomans from within, Britain would support the creation of an independent Arab state after the war, covering a vast stretch of the Middle East. The correspondence was intentionally vague about exact borders, a vagueness that would later become one of the most bitterly disputed details in the entire conflict. Hussein read it as covering Palestine. British officials would later argue it didn't. Whichever reading is correct, Hussein launched the Arab Revolt in June 1916, and Arab forces, including a young Hussein loyalist named Faisal, working alongside a British officer named T.A. Lawrence, fought a real costly guerrilla campaign against Ottoman forces that tied down tens of thousands of Ottoman troops and helped crack open the empire's eastern flank. That's promise number one: an independent Arab homeland, in exchange for blood spent fighting Britain's enemy. At almost exactly the same time, Britain made a second contradictory promise, and this one wasn't public at all. In 1916, British diplomat Sir Mark Sykes and his French counterpart, Francois-Georges-Picot, secretly negotiated an agreement to carve up the Ottoman Middle East between Britain and France after the war. Spheres of direct and indirect control stretching from the Mediterranean to Persia, with Palestine itself marked out for a special international administration rather than Arab self-rule. Sykes-Picot didn't erase the promise to Hussein. It simply ignored it, drawing new lines over the same map behind his back, assuming, correctly, as it turned out, that he wouldn't find out until it was too late to matter. That's promise number 2. European partition, negotiated in total secrecy, incompatible with promise number 1. Then came the third. On November 2, 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour signed a letter addressed to Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild, a British peer, a trained zoologist, and by his own family's estimation something of a black sheep among the Rothschild bankers, but also the most prominent figurehead of the British Zionist movement at the time. Wiseman himself later said that when Balfour asked who the letter should be addressed to, it was Wiseman who suggested Rothschild, a practical choice, since Rothschild held the institutional standing within British Jewish leadership to receive it. The letter read in full, just 67 words. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. 67 words. A national home for the Jewish people, in the same land Britain had already implied would form part of an independent Arab state, on the same land Britain had already secretly agreed to carve up with France. Why did Britain make this third promise on top of 2 others it hadn't kept or hadn't disclosed? Multiple motives were operating at once, and historians still argue about the relative weight of each. This isn't a case with one clean answer. First, there was genuine, long-standing sympathy for Zionism among key figures in the British establishment, including Balfour himself, rooted partly in religious conviction and partly in decades of European Zionist lobbying that predated the war entirely. Second, there was wartime propaganda calculation. British officials believed, not always accurately, that a public declaration of support for Zionism could help sway Jewish public opinion in Russia, where a wobbling Eastern Front badly needed steadying, and in the still neutral turned newly belligerent United States, where the government hoped to shore up support for the war effort. Third, and this returns us to part 2, there was strategy. A Jewish population under British sponsorship in Palestine, dependent on British goodwill, was viewed by some cabinet members as a useful, friendly presence guarding that critical land bridge to Suez and India, a stabilizing British-aligned foothold in a region Britain could not afford to lose. And fourth, France was a live rival throughout. British officials worried that if they didn't move first and stake a claim rooted in Zionist support, France's own historic claims to influence over Palestine and the wider Levant might crowd Britain out of the post-war settlement entirely. None of these motives required Britain to actually keep the promise fairly, or to reconcile it with the promises already made to the Arabs. And Britain didn't. The declaration's own carefully hedged language: national home, not state. Civil and religious rights, not political rights. For the existing non-Jewish communities, a majority of the population reduced in the text to a description of what they weren't, was, from the start, a document built to be read differently by everyone who read it. 3 promises, 3 audiences, 1 piece of land. And the people actually living there, the Arab majority of Palestine, roughly 9 in 10 residents at the time, were never consulted about any of it. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. The declaration's fiercest internal opponent inside the British cabinet wasn't an Arab representative. There wasn't one in the room. It was Edwin Montagu, Secretary of State for India, and the only Jewish member of the cabinet at the time. Montagu argued, repeatedly and forcefully, against the declaration on the grounds that a formal British endorsement of Jewish nationhood would hand ammunition to anti-Semites across Europe, who could now claim that Jews were a foreign nation with dual loyalty rather than full citizens of the countries they lived in. He also warned, with real prescience, that Britain was about to make promises about a country most of Whitehall had never visited, to people who did not live there, about the futures of people who did. He lost the argument. But his objection is a useful reminder that the Jewish community was never a single monolithic bloc cheering this on. There was real, serious internal Jewish debate about whether Zionism was even a good idea, debate that the declaration supporters had to overcome as much as any external opposition. Because the letter was addressed to a Rothschild, this is the point where a lot of retellings jump to conspiracy. The idea that a single banking dynasty quietly bought or blackmailed an empire into handing over a country. That version is both historically wrong and worth explicitly setting aside, because the real relationship between the Rothschild family and Zionist settlement is interesting enough without the embellishment. And the embellished version has a long, ugly history of its own, recycled by anti-Semitic propagandists for over a century to claim that Jewish financiers secretly steer world events. The documented history doesn't support that claim, and it's worth being precise about what actually happened instead. The real Rothschild story starts decades before Balfour, and it centers on a different family member entirely. Baron Edmund James de Rothschild, of the French branch of the family, a private philanthropist rather than a diplomat or power broker. Starting in the early 1880s, Edmund de Rothschild began personally funding early Jewish agricultural settlements in Ottoman Palestine, buying land, underwriting irrigation and viticulture projects, funding schools and clinics for a wave of Jewish immigrants fleeing pogroms in the Russian Empire. He poured what would amount to tens of millions of dollars in today's money into these colonies over several decades, to the point that historians often describe him as the single most important private financier of Jewish settlement in Palestine before the Balfour Declaration ever existed. He did this as personal philanthropy, motivated by his own Zionist sympathies and Jewish communal responsibility, not as a coordinated banking house policy, and not with the House of Rothschild's financial institutions acting as some unified bloc. Walter Rothschild, the recipient of the 1917 letter, was a very different figure, a naturalist who kept a private zoo and rode a carriage pulled by zebras, more interested in beetles and birds than in banking, and by several accounts genuinely uncomfortable with high-stakes diplomacy. He was chosen as the letter's addressee, not because he held financial leverage over the British government, but because, as president of the English Zionist Federation, he was the person institutionally positioned to receive it on behalf of British Jewry. So the honest version of the Rothschild story is this. One family member's decades of patient, personal philanthropic investment helped build the physical settlements, the land, the towns, the agricultural infrastructure that gave the Zionist movement something real on the ground in Palestine by 1917, making the national home concept look less like an abstraction and more like a project already underway. Another family member's institutional standing made him the correct name to put on an envelope. Neither fact supports the idea of a banking family manipulating British war finance into submission. What actually applied the pressure on Britain's finances, as I told you earlier, was Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. Treasury, and the sheer unprecedented scale of a world war, not a private family fortune. It's worth pausing on why this distinction matters. The financial crisis explanation and the strategic value explanation are supported by Treasury records, cabinet papers, and decades of peer-reviewed economic history. The secret Jewish banking cabal explanation is supported by nothing but the recurring human temptation to find a single, hidden hand behind complicated events, and it has done real, measurable harm every time it's been recycled, from the 1920s through to conspiracy content still circulating today. Getting the Balfour Declaration's real causes right isn't just good history. It's how you inoculate yourself against a genuinely dangerous myth. If money and strategy explain why Britain wanted a Middle East policy that served its interests, they don't fully explain why this particular policy, worded this particular way, landed on Balfour's desk when it did. For that you need one more figure, Chaim Weizmann, not as a chemist trading a patent for a country, but as one of the most effective political operators of the early 20th century. Weizmann arrived in Britain in 1904 and, with real patience, spent over a decade building relationships inside Manchester's liberal political establishment, cultivating a friendship with C.P. Scott, the influential editor of the Manchester Guardian, who in turn opened doors to senior liberal politicians including Balfour and a rising figure named David Lloyd George. By the time the war started, Weizmann wasn't a stranger showing up with a chemistry patent and a demand. He was a known, trusted quantity inside a political network that within a few years controlled the British government. The acetone work mattered here, just not as payment. It mattered because it moved Weizmann from interesting Manchester academic with political opinions to a man whose discovery the Ministry of Munitions, under Lloyd George, was actively grateful for. That gratitude opened Whitehall doors that patient networking alone might have taken years longer to open. Access accelerated the relationship. It didn't purchase the outcome. What Weizmann did with that access was relentless, sustained argument tailored to whoever he was talking to. To strategists worried about Suez, he framed a British-sponsored Jewish Palestine as a loyal buffer state guarding the empire's eastern lifeline. To wartime propagandists anxious about the Eastern Front, He framed it as a tool for winning over Jewish opinion in Russia and America. To genuine ideological sympathizers like Balfour, he made the moral and historical case directly. There's a famous exchange, recounted by Wiseman himself, where Balfour asked why Zionists had rejected an earlier, competing British offer of a Jewish homeland in East Africa. Wiseman's reported answer: "We had Jerusalem when London was a marsh." Whether the line was delivered exactly that way or polished afterward in the retelling, it captures the tactic. Wiseman consistently met imperial officials where they lived in arguments about strategy and history, not sentiment. By late 1916 and into 1917, several forces converged at once. A change in British government brought Lloyd George to the premiership and Balfour to the Foreign Office, both men more receptive to Zionism than their predecessors. The Russian Revolution threw Russia's continued participation in the war into doubt, sharpening British interest in anything that might shore up pro-war sentiment among Russian Jews. American entry into the war raised the stakes of American public opinion, and British forces began their advance into Palestine itself, making the post-war disposition of the territory a live, practical question rather than a hypothetical one. Wiseman didn't create any of these conditions. What he did patiently for over a decade was make sure that when they all arrived together, there was already a fully formed Zionist case sitting on the desks of the people who mattered, ready to be acted on. That is the real mechanism behind the Balfour Declaration's timing, not a single dramatic reward for a single dramatic discovery, but years of political groundwork meeting a moment of imperial vulnerability and strategic calculation. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath everything we've covered so far. Britain got away with promising the same territory 3 times because, in November 1917, nobody outside a small circle of officials knew all 3 promises existed simultaneously. McMahon's letters to Hussein were correspondence between 2 parties, not a public treaty. Sykes-Picot was explicitly secret, so secret that its existence was only exposed to the world by the new Bolshevik government in Russia, which found the agreement in captured Tsarist archives after the 1917 revolution and published it specifically to embarrass the old imperial powers. The Balfour Declaration, by contrast, was public and deliberately publicized because, unlike the other 2, publicity was the entire point of making it. When Sykes-Picot became public knowledge in late 1917, Sharif Hussein and the wider Arab world learned, in the middle of an active military campaign, they were still fighting on Britain's behalf, that their British ally had secretly agreed to hand large parts of the promised Arab homeland to France. British officials scrambled to reassure Hussein the agreement wouldn't be implemented as written. It was roughly implemented as written, the consequences compounded from there. The 1919 Paris Peace Conference tried and largely failed to reconcile competing claims. A King Crane commission sent by the Americans to survey opinion on the ground found overwhelming Arab opposition to both French control and a Jewish national home, and its findings were quietly shelved by the powers that had commissioned it. At the San Remo Conference in 1920, Britain and France formalized the Sykes-Picot carve-up almost exactly as originally drawn, folding the Balfour Declaration's language directly into the terms of the future British mandate for Palestine. The League of Nations made it official in 1922, effectively giving Britain international legal cover to pursue the Balfour Declaration's aims while simultaneously governing a territory whose Arab majority had never agreed to any of it. Jewish immigration to Palestine increased through the 1920s and 30s, driven by Zionist settlement and, with grim inevitability, by escalating anti-Semitic persecution in Europe that would culminate in the Holocaust, a catastrophe that transformed the case for a Jewish homeland from a political project into, for millions, an urgent matter of survival. Arab opposition to the scale of that immigration and to the terms of the mandate itself hardened into organized resistance and periodic violent uprisings throughout the 1920s and 30s. Britain, having promised incompatible things to incompatible parties in order to solve a wartime financial and strategic problem, found itself administering an unsolvable political one for the next 3 decades, and by 1947, exhausted, financially ruined again by a Second World War, and unable to reconcile the promises it had made, Britain handed the entire Palestine question to the newly formed United Nations and withdrew. It's worth being honest about scale and proportion here because it's tempting to draw too straight a line. The Balfour Declaration did not, by itself, cause everything that followed in the following century of conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, decades of subsequent wars, political choices, and competing nationalisms all shaped outcomes no single 1917 document could have determined. But it was the founding document that gave international great power legitimacy to Jewish national aspirations in Palestine for the first time, at the exact moment those aspirations collided with a competing, equally legitimate Arab national movement that had also just been promised a homeland of its own by the same empire within the same 18 months. That is the specific, documented mechanism by which one empire's wartime financial and strategic desperation produced a conflict that is still right now in 2026 shaping the news you read. So why does any of this matter today, more than a century later? Because the core structural problem the Balfour Declaration created, two national movements, each holding what it considers a legitimate historical promise to the same land, each capable of pointing to a real document as evidence, has never actually been resolved. It's been fought over, negotiated over, and partitioned over, but the fundamental tension embedded in those 67 words in 1917 is still, in large part, the fundamental tension of the conflict today. And because the way this history gets told matters, tell it as grateful empire rewards brilliant chemist, and you erase the actual mechanics of imperial decision-making, the debt, the desperation, the competing secret promises, and you erase the Arab population of Palestine almost entirely from their own story. Tell it as secret bankers engineered a war for profit, and you're not doing history at all. You're recycling a conspiracy trope that has caused real harm for 100 years, and you're still somehow managing to erase the actual Arab and Jewish people whose lives were shaped by decisions made almost entirely without their input. The accurate version is less tidy than either myth. It involves a genuine financial crisis. It involves genuine, long-standing Zionist political organizing that predates the war by decades. It involves genuine imperial strategy around Suez in India. It involves genuine wartime propaganda calculations that turned out to be based on shaky assumptions about Jewish political unity in Russia and America. And it involves a document that, by design, could be read as a promise of statehood by some and a promise of protected minority rights by others. An ambiguity that wasn't an accident, but a feature, because it let a financially desperate empire tell three different audiences three different things and hope the bill never came due. The bill came due, it's still coming due. In 1917, a nation drowning in debt, dependent on American money it didn't control, and desperate to secure its lifeline to the rest of its empire, wrote a 67-word letter promising a homeland in a country it did not yet govern, to a people who were not the majority of that country's population, on top of two other promises it had already made and would not keep. It was not an act of imperial generosity. It was an act of imperial improvisation made under financial and military pressure, by officials juggling more commitments than they could ever honor at once. More than 100 years later, the world is still living inside the consequences of that improvisation. That's the story the acetone myth was never built to tell you. If you want to understand how we got from a Manchester chemistry lab and a London treasury crisis to the headlines of this year, now you know where it actually started.